The hall aboard the Terran starship was filled with representatives from 3 of the galaxy's most powerful species. The Saranai stood quietly, their feathered crests shifting in interest, while the Greys sat silently, their large eyes taking in every detail. The Virexians, however, barely hid their growing frustration as they waited for the presentation to begin. At the center of it all, a Terran scientist stepped forward, his face bright with enthusiasm. Behind him, a large display showed the starship's power system, with a diagram of the lava system glowing in the background.
Thank you all for being here today,
the scientist began.
What you're about to see is the future of energy.
He gestured to the display.
This ship is powered entirely by the localized amplified voltaic accumulator, or lava system. With this technology, power is generated using our proprietary geothermal harvesting techniques. Then it is remotely transferred directly to where it's needed via quantum entanglement, without the need for fuel, reactors, or traditional generators.
He paused, letting that sink in. The Saranai delegates exchanged glances, their crests lowering in what seemed to be approval. One of them leaned forward.
This could change how we expand our colonies,
he murmured quietly to another. The Grey delegate, always focused on facts, raised a hand.
How far can the energy be transferred?
The scientist smiled, clearly expecting this question.
With our current setup, we can send power across systems. The limit is still being tested, but the range is far beyond anything previously possible.
The Greys nodded, impressed. They didn't need to speak to show their approval. The technology was exactly what they'd been hoping for. But the Virexians were less pleased. Their leader, General Kratek, leaned over to his advisor. His mandibles clicked in annoyance.
They show us this,
he hissed,
but they refuse to give us what matters.
The advisor, equally tense, responded quietly.
They will never give us the core technology. They want control.
Meanwhile, the scientist continued.
With lava, ships will no longer need to dock to refuel. Colonies can be supplied with massive amounts of power, and stations can operate independently without ever needing to rely on external fuel sources. The potential is limitless.
Kratek's frustration was clear. He couldn't stay silent any longer.
You offer power,
he said, his voice sharp.
But you refuse to sell the technology?
The room grew quiet, all eyes on the Virexian general. The scientist didn't flinch. He had prepared for this.
We're offering lava receivers, he said calmly. You will have access to the energy, but no, we will not be selling the core schematics or ground generators.
Kratek's mandibles tightened, and his multifaceted eyes darkened.
So you keep control over all energy in the galaxy? That's your plan?
The scientist stayed polite, his tone measured.
We believe it's safer this way. The system is complex, and it requires a specific setup. We can't risk it being misused.
One of the Saranai delegates turned his head slightly, observing Kratek's reaction. They remained silent, but watched closely. Kratek leaned back, his voice now low, meant only for his advisor.
We'll see who controls the stars soon enough.
The Terran scientist, unaware of the quiet exchange, smiled again, addressing the crowd as a whole.
The future is now, and it's powered by lava.
The future of energy had just been revealed, but not everyone in that room was prepared to let the Terrans keep it to themselves. The hall on the Terran ship bustled with conversation. Delegates from multiple species mingled and discussed what they had just witnessed. The successful demonstration of the lava system had sparked a wave of intrigue and interest. For the most part, the atmosphere seemed calm, but beneath the surface, tensions simmered, especially with the Virexians. At one corner of the hall, a group of Saranai stood in a circle, their feathered crests shimmering faintly as they spoke in low voices. Their calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the rising tension elsewhere. One of the Saranai, a feathered sage with a particularly vibrant crest, addressed the others. This technology, he said, his voice smooth and full of wonder, it holds the potential to change the course of history, not through war, but through peace. His crest flared slightly, a sign of pride. With lava, entire colonies can thrive without the fear of resource scarcity. Imagine, brothers and sisters, how we could grow. A younger Saranai tilted her head.
Do you believe the Terrans will share it freely?
The feathered sage's eyes flickered toward the Terran delegation at the center of the room, where high-ranking officials exchanged pleasantries with other species. Perhaps not freely, he said, but they will not refuse us. Humanity has looked to us for guidance since our contact. They see us as the creators of their kind, after all. The others murmured in agreement. For the Saranai, the lava system represented more than just power. It was a step toward furthering their long-standing goal of universal harmony and growth. Nearby, a group of gray delegates huddled together, their large black eyes observing every movement in the room. Unlike the Saranai, the Greys were not here to marvel at the Terrans' innovation. They were here to secure a deal.
We should move quickly,
one Gray delegate said, his voice steady but firm.
The Terrans are holding their cards close. They'll need more than admiration to be convinced to share this technology.
Another Gray, more senior, raised a hand, silencing the group.
Patience,
he said, his voice almost monotone.
The Terrans will sell when they realize the opportunities. We do not need the core technology. The receivers will suffice.
The younger Gray looked skeptical.
And what if they restrict access even to that?
The senior Gray's large, unblinking eyes moved toward the Terran officials.
We will push for partnership. A technology like this, if hoarded, could disrupt the balance. They know this as well as we do.
From across the room, a Virexian officer stood near a wall, his 4 arms crossed, standing in barely restrained frustration as he listened to the ongoing conversations. Every word he overheard, about partnerships, peaceful growth, and shared energy, only fueled his resolve. He glanced at his fellow Virexians, who remained silent, blending into the background while their minds worked through the complexities of the mission ahead. General Kratak entered the hall, moving to stand beside the officer. His multifaceted eyes scanned the room, noting how relaxed the Terrans appeared, how confident the Saranai and Greys seemed. His mandibles tightened as he watched the Terran delegation, heads held high, believing they had secured their position of power.
Fools,
he muttered under his breath. The officer beside him nodded in agreement, though he kept his voice low.
They think they've already won.
Kratak didn't bother hiding his disdain.
Their arrogance will be their undoing. The lava system is theirs for now, but not for long.
The officer cast a glance toward the Saranai, who were still engaged in their philosophical discussions about peaceful growth. His mandibles twitched slightly.
They don't realize how fragile their peace is.
Kratak's multifaceted eyes gleamed in satisfaction.
And that's exactly why we must take it.
The officer didn't respond, but his focus shifted momentarily to the holographic map projected in the corner of the room. It showed the Energy Production and Intelligence Core, or EPIC HQ on Terra, where all their attention would soon be focused. He could feel the weight of their mission looming. Soon they would make their move. On the other side of the hall, a Terran official stood with a Grey delegate, discussing potential collaborations.
We can't overlook the possibilities here,
the Grey said, his tone neutral but probing.
Your lava system has applications far beyond simple energy supply. Starship fleets, planetary defenses. What you've created is the backbone of a new era.
The Terran official nodded slowly. We know, he replied, but sharing this technology is risky. We can't afford to let it fall into the wrong hands. The Grey delegate tilted his head slightly.
And who decides which hands are the wrong ones?
There was a pause, a flicker of unease in the Terran official's eyes.
We control the core for a reason. It's not just about the power itself. It's about how it's used. I understand your concern, the Grey said calmly. But restricting access could create far greater risks. A monopoly on energy isn't easily accepted, especially by those who are,
he glanced briefly at the Virexians,
less patient.
The Terran official followed the Grey's gaze, catching sight of General Kratak across the room. The Virexian general stood in a stiff, calculated posture, his eyes locked on the Terrans. There was no mistaking the animosity in his gaze.
We are aware of that, the Terran said quietly.
Meanwhile, Kratak's attention shifted from the Terrans to the Virexians at his side. He leaned toward his officer, speaking in a low, confident tone.
Everything is ready. Our team is already en route.
The officer gave a single nod.
We'll retrieve the schematics and be out before they even notice.
Kratak's mandibles twitched into a cruel grin.
Let them have their partnerships, their diplomacy. When the power is in our hands, the galaxy will bow.
From across the room, a Saranai delegate looked up, catching sight of Kratak's predatory stance. He watched the Virexians with a distant curiosity, sensing something off in their demeanor. But he said nothing, turning back to his fellow Saranai with a peaceful smile.
With this technology, we could usher in an age of unprecedented growth, the Saranai delegate said. We must ensure that humanity uses it for the benefit of all.
The conversations in the hall continued as the Virexians quietly finalized their plans. The others in the room, whether discussing peace or partnerships, had no idea what was about to unfold. The Terrans believed they had secured their future. The Saranai believed in a new age of harmony, and the Greys, ever calculating, saw the potential in the partnerships they sought. But the Virexians, silent and watchful, were preparing to make their move. A move that would shake the balance of power before the night was through. Hours later, aboard the Virexian stealth ship, cloaked in the shadows of Terra's orbit, the atmosphere inside was thick with anticipation. The sleek, darkened interior of the ship reflected the seriousness of the mission ahead. The crew moved with precision, making final preparations for their covert operation. At the center of the planning room, Commander Kratak stood over a holographic map of Epic headquarters. His mandibles clicked in controlled frustration as he traced the security grid with one of his 4 fingers. Around him, his team of elite warriors and engineers waited in silence, their exoskeletons glistening in the dim light.
We take what they refuse to give,
Kratak said, his voice low but filled with determination.
Tonight, we own their secrets.
The hologram flickered as the map zoomed in on the key points of entry. The security around Epic HQ was tight, but the Virexians had studied it for weeks. They knew where the weak points were, how to bypass the alarms, and how to navigate the most secure facility on Terra. A Virexian engineer, smaller than the warriors but just as fierce, stepped forward. His multifaceted eyes flickered as he examined the data.
The Terrans think they're untouchable behind these walls,
he said, tapping at the map.
But their security is not as advanced as they believe. We'll disable their systems before they even know we're inside.
Kratak's mandibles spread into something close to a grin.
Good,
he replied, his voice barely more than a growl.
The lava core will be ours. They won't know what hit them.
One of the warriors stepped forward, his muscular arms crossed over his chest.
What about resistance?
He asked.
The Terrans will be alert after the demonstration.
Kratak waved a hand dismissively.
The Terrans are fools. They've already grown too comfortable with their new power. They'll be watching the skies for battleships, not their own backyard. By the time they realize what's happening, it will be too late.
The crew nodded in agreement. Their plan was simple, and simplicity was their strength. They would strike swiftly without warning and retrieve the lava schematics before the Terrans had time to react. The stealth ship's internal lights dimmed further as they neared their descent window. The Virexians operated in darkness, both literally and figuratively. Cloaked from Terra's sensors, the ship would descend into the planet's atmosphere, invisible to all detection systems. Kratek turned back to the crew, his voice commanding.
This mission will not fail. We have spent months preparing for this moment. The Terrans think they can control the galaxy's energy, but after tonight, that control will be ours.
The crew straightened, their mandibles clicking in acknowledgement. The tension in the room was heavy, but it only fueled their resolve. Each Virexian knew their role. Each was ready to strike. As the countdown to their descent began, the lead engineer checked his systems one last time.
All cloaking systems are operational. The Terrans won't detect a thing until we're already inside the core facility.
Kratek nodded.
Good. We move in swift and silent. Once we've got the data, we leave no trace.
The stealth ship's engines were quieter than a whisper as they descended. The planet below began to loom larger in the ship's viewports, the lights of Terran cities just dots far below. The dark mass of Epic headquarters stood in contrast, surrounded by vast sheets of ice, the cool Arctic climate maintaining the essential electronics buried within, remote, secure, and powerful, but not for long. Kratek turned to his second-in-command, a fierce warrior with deep green markings along his exoskeleton.
The Terrans will pay for their arrogance,
Kratek said.
Prepare the team. We make our move.
The second-in-command saluted, and the warriors dispersed to gather their gear. They moved like shadows, blending into the darkness of the ship, silent and efficient. The engineer continued to work at his console, ensuring that the cloaking devices and jamming systems were fully operational.
Once we breach the perimeter, he said, I'll disable their internal security. It'll take them hours to figure out what's going on. By then, we'll be long gone.
Kratek stepped up beside him, staring out of the viewport at the slowly approaching planet.
They've grown soft, he muttered, relying on their technology, their diplomacy. They've forgotten the power of fear.
The engineer glanced at him, his mandibles twitching in a slight grin.
They'll remember soon enough.
As the countdown hit 0, the stealth ship began its silent descent toward the surface. Terra's atmosphere buffeted against the hull, but the ship remained invisible, undetectable. No alarms sounded. No lights blinked in the distance. The Terrans had no idea what was coming.
Engage Phase 2,
Kratek ordered. The ship's jamming systems activated, scrambling any nearby signals, further ensuring their stealthy approach. The ship slowed as it neared Epic HQ, hovering just above a nearby ridge. The facility loomed in the distance, a fortress of advanced technology and energy, exactly what the Virexians had come to claim. Kratek stood tall, looking down at his team as they gathered in the drop bay, ready to make their descent.
Tonight, we change the balance of power,
he said, his voice strong and filled with conviction.
The Terrans will regret ever thinking they could control us.
The warriors nodded in unison, their mandibles clicking together in anticipation. The drop doors opened silently, revealing the barren, icy terrain below. One by one, the Virexian team dropped into the night, their forms disappearing into the shadows as they made their way toward Epic headquarters. Kratek watched them go, his eyes narrowing in satisfaction.
The future belongs to us,
he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. The last of his warriors vanished into the darkness, and the ship cloaked itself once again, waiting in orbit for the moment of their victory. The night sky above Epic headquarters was clear, with only the faintest glow from the distant city lights in the background. The massive facility stood isolated, surrounded by frozen tundra and ice cliffs, its defensive perimeter patrolled by advanced drones and Terran guards. At first glance, it appeared impenetrable. But for the Virexian stealth team, this was just another obstacle. Their sleek black forms moved silently through the crevices between ice sheets. Their cloaking devices hid them from view, rendering them almost invisible to any detection systems, while jamming technology disrupted the facility's external sensors just long enough for them to slip through. Commander Kratek led the way, his multifaceted eyes scanning the area ahead. Behind him, his team moved in perfect unison, their movements precise and rehearsed. Each step was calculated, each breath controlled. They had studied the layout of Epic HQ for months and knew exactly where the weak points were.
"We enter from the south,"
Kratek whispered into his communicator, his voice barely audible even to his own team.
"Move fast and silent. We've got less than an hour before the systems recalibrate."
His team nodded in acknowledgement, their focus unwavering. They approached the southern fence, a nearly invisible barrier that hummed with energy. One of the Virexian engineers crouched beside it, pulling a small device from his belt. A few quick taps on the interface, and the energy field blinked out.
"We are in,"
the engineer whispered. Kratek nodded and motioned for the team to move forward. They slipped through the now disabled fence and moved across the open ground, sticking close to the shadows. Ahead of them, Epic HQ loomed like a fortress. They would need to bypass several layers of security before reaching the core, but Kratek had no doubts. The Terrans were skilled, but the Virexians were better. They reached the first checkpoint, a heavily guarded entrance monitored by cameras and armed security. The team stayed low, using their cloaking technology to remain unseen. Kratek signaled to the second engineer, who quickly hacked into the camera system, looping the feed to show nothing but empty corridors.
"Go,"
Kratek ordered. The team slipped inside, moving through the facility with silent efficiency. They passed guards, slipped through checkpoints, and avoided every sensor. It was a flawless operation, until they reached the inner sanctum where the lava core was housed. As they approached the large reinforced doors, the lead engineer whispered,
"This is it. The core is beyond these doors. I need time to bypass the encryption."
Kratek nodded and motioned for the others to take defensive positions around the corridor.
"Make it quick. We don't have much time."
The engineer set to work, fingers flying across his device as he hacked into the door's system. The seconds ticked by, but Kratek's patience never wavered. They were close, so close. Finally, the doors slid open with a faint hiss. Inside, the lava core sat in the center of the room, a massive glowing structure pulsing with power being pulled from the heart of Terra. The room was pristine, its walls lined with advanced Terran technology. This was the heart of Terra's new power. Kratek stepped inside, his eyes gleaming.
"It's beautiful,"
he muttered under his breath. The engineer wasted no time. He rushed to the core's control panel and began downloading the schematics. As the data transferred, Kratek turned to his second-in-command.
"Guard the entrance. We're not alone for much longer."
Outside the core room, one of the Terran security officers paused, frowning as he glanced at his monitor. Something was off. A small anomaly in the system, barely noticeable, but enough to catch his attention. "Hey, check this out," he said, gesturing to his colleague. "Looks like we've got a glitch in the feeds near the core. You think we should check it out?" His colleague shrugged, but there was a hint of concern in his eyes. "Better safe than sorry." They alerted their superior and moved toward the core, their hands resting on their sidearms. Inside the core room, the data transfer was nearly complete. Kratek watched the progress bar inch toward 100%, his nerves taut.
"How much longer?"
he asked, his voice low.
"Almost there,"
the engineer replied.
"Another few seconds."
Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. The second-in-command tensed, motioning for them to take defensive positions. Kratek's mandibles clicked in frustration.
"They're onto us. Hold them off until we're finished."
The Terran security officers rounded the corner just in time to see the open door. Their eyes widened in shock, and one of them immediately drew his weapon. Intruders! But before they could react, the Virexians struck. Moving with lightning speed, they closed the distance in seconds. The first Terran was knocked unconscious with a swift blow to the head. The second managed to fire a shot, but it went wide, ricocheting off the wall as a Virexian warrior tackled him to the ground. The sound of the skirmish alerted the rest of the Terran security force. Alarms blared, and the entire facility went into lockdown. The narrow corridors of Epic HQ became a battlefield. Virexian warriors engaged the nearby Terran guards in brutal close-quarters combat. The Terrans fought fiercely, but the Virexians were faster, stronger, and better prepared. Their cloaking devices gave them the advantage, allowing them to strike from the shadows and disappear before the Terrans could retaliate. One of the Terran officers, pinned against the wall by a Virexian warrior, growled through gritted teeth.
You won't get away with this!
The Virexian replied smugly,
We already have.
With a swift strike, the officer was knocked unconscious, and the Virexians continued their advance. Back in the core room, the download finally completed. The engineer disconnected his device and turned to Kratak, triumph in his eyes.
We've got it! The lava schematics are ours!
Kratak's voice shifted to satisfaction.
Good. Let's move.
But as they turned to leave, the doors slammed shut with a heavy clang. Red lights flashed overhead, and a voice echoed through the facility's intercom.
Intruders detected. Lockdown initiated.
Kratak cursed under his breath.
They're trying to trap us in here.
The engineer quickly scanned his device.
I can override the doors, but it'll take a minute.
We don't have a minute,
Kratak growled. Outside the core room, the sound of footsteps and shouts grew louder. The Terran backup forces were closing in. Finally, the engineer managed to override the door. It slid open just as the first wave of Terran reinforcements arrived.
Move!
Kratak shouted. The Virexian team bolted from the core room, engaging the Terrans in a vicious fight as they made their way back toward their escape route. Blaster fire lit up the narrow corridors, and the sounds of combat echoed through the facility. Despite the fierce resistance, the Virexians were unstoppable. One by one, they cut down the Terran guards, their advanced weapons and cloaking technology giving them the upper hand. Finally, they reached the exit. Kratak glanced back at his team, all accounted for, and then up at the sky. Their stealth ship hovered above, waiting for their signal.
Mission accomplished,
he muttered, his mandibles clicking in satisfaction. With a final burst of energy, the Virexians activated their cloaking devices and disappeared into the night, leaving Epic HQ in chaos. As the stealth ship ascended into the atmosphere, Kratak allowed himself a moment of triumph. The lava schematics were theirs, and the power of the Terrans would soon be broken.
They'll never see it coming,
he said more to himself than anyone else. But, deep in the core of the schematics, a hidden virus had been planted. A virus that would soon bring the Virexians' triumph to a screeching halt. The Virexian stealth ship soared silently through Terra's atmosphere, its cloaking technology fully engaged. Inside the ship, the mood was triumphant. Commander Kratak stood at the helm, his mandibles spread in a rare, satisfied grin as he watched the planet shrink below them.
We did it,
one of the warriors said, pride evident in his voice.
The schematics are ours.
The Virexian engineer was busy at his console, finalizing the decryption of the data. He nodded, confidence in every movement.
The Terrans will have no idea what hit them. Their greatest secret is now in our hands.
Kratak's eyes gleamed as he watched the stars grow brighter.
Prepare for warp,
he commanded.
We leave this system now.
The ship's engines began to hum, the familiar vibration signaling the jump to warp speed. But then, suddenly, everything stopped. The hum of the engines died out. The lights on the console flickered and went dark. The ship drifted to a halt, the faint glow of Terra's atmosphere still visible outside the viewport. Kratak felt a cold sense of dread settle over him.
What's happening?
He snapped, turning toward the engineer. The engineer's hands flew over the controls, his movements becoming frantic. He tried rebooting the systems, accessing the power grid, anything, but nothing responded.
It's not working! Everything's offline!
The engineer's voice trembled with disbelief. Kratak moved to the console, shoving the engineer aside. He tapped commands into the interface, but the screens remained blank, unresponsive. A cold silence filled the ship as they realized the gravity of the situation.
They've outsmarted us,
Kratak muttered, his voice filled with fury.
It's a virus! They must have embedded it in the schematics!
The engineer's mandibles clicked nervously.
A failsafe to prevent anyone from stealing it.
Kratak growled, pacing in frustration.
We've been played.
He turned to his crew, his anger barely contained.
Do we have any power left? Communications?
The engineer shook his head, panic creeping into his voice.
Nothing long range. We're almost completely disabled. Just enough reserves for the distress beacon.
Kratak's eyes narrowed. This couldn't be happening. They had planned for every contingency, every scenario. But the Terrans had been one step ahead. They were stranded, helpless, floating in orbit with no way to escape.
We have no choice,
Kratak finally said, his voice bitter.
We'll have to send out a distress signal.
The crew fell silent. They all understood what this meant. Humiliation, defeat. They would be at the mercy of the very people they had tried to rob. The engineer hesitated.
To the Terrans?
Kratak's mandibles clicked angrily.
Do it!
Moments later, a signal was transmitted from the disabled stealth ship, broadcasting across Terra's communication network. Inside Epic HQ, a Terran officer sat at his desk, monitoring incoming transmissions. A notification pinged on his screen, and he raised an eyebrow as he read the details. "Distress signal," he muttered. "From a Virexian ship?" He tapped a few keys, and the ship's location popped up on the map, hovering just beyond Terra's atmosphere. A slow smirk spread across his face as he realized what had happened. "I guess you'll be needing our power after all," he said with a chuckle, before sending the response.